And so for people that have small sterilizers, you'll be able to get 2 trays in. For people that have medium-sized sterilizers, you'll get a minimum of 4 with our smallest tray. But it's the ophthalmology still centers that are lagging behind, because some of them still do think you can interrupt the cycle. They believe that.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On today's Vendor Spotlight, we will be speaking with Barbara Ann Harmer, Vice President of Clinical Services with IST One Tray. She's got a great deal of experience in ophthalmology, Melanie, and has actually been a principal clinical investigator for the United States on TASS. So if you've worked in ophthalmology, you definitely know TASS, and you probably do even if you didn't work in ophthalmology. So we're going to talk about some efficiencies that can come from utilizing the One Tray in your ophthalmology services, but also she's got some crazy stories, Melanie.
Yes, she does. Blew my hair back a little bit listening to some of the things that she's seen in different centers that have been trying to work quickly, be more efficient, and do things faster, but at the cost of patient safety. And the things that she has seen is crazy. And then now to learn from her about a better solution that doesn't sacrifice patient safety, it's really exciting to talk to her about it.
All right. Well, if you want to know what we're talking about, you've got to stay with us. And we're going to be right back after a short break with Barbara Ann Harmer from IST One Tray.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Barbara Ann Harmer, Vice President of Clinical Services, joining us here on First Case. She's going to be talking all about One Tray and understanding the ophthalmology applications of One Tray. And so, Melanie, I know talked with Barbara before. We both have. She's been on several interviews on the Beyond Clean brand and also here on First Case in the past. And so, Barbara, I want to welcome you back to the show.
Thanks, Justin. Hi, Melanie.
So what's super interesting, Barbara, is how you got in to ophthalmology. I did not know this about you. We've spoken person, I don't even know how many times, but we've done these podcasts and I had no idea your involvement in that world. And even some of the efforts that you put forth when we began hearing about TASS and investigating the causes. So I thought as we kind of get started here, why don't you tell us about all your experience in this area?
It wasn't a chosen specialty like it isn't for most. I was the youngest in the operating room, just starting out, and I was selected by my peers to learn how to do ophthalmologic cases. So that's how I actually got involved, because whenever there were cases on the schedule, unlike today, it would take us an hour and 50 minutes to do a cataract. And so it was the early days of moving cataract surgery. That was still in a hospital, but before it ever evolved into going into the surgical centers. But once I started it, besides I was multi-specialty, I did everything. I kind of took a knack to it and enjoyed it. Then became intimately involved with ophthalmology on a national perspective, but then internationally when a primary ophthalmologic company decided that myself and a doctor from Emory in Atlanta, Georgia, right down the street from the CDC, needed to go on a year-long tour of Canada and teach them all about toxic anterior segment syndrome and toxic endothelial cell destruction. TECD seems to have lost its favoritism in the United States, but you talked about both of them. They were both problematic. TECD actually more important than TASS, since TECD is once you lose your endothelial cells, they don't come back. And so that had much more of a lasting circumstance for patients. But TASS became the focal point even in Canada. And this was prior to one of the first cases that was spoken about in 2006 in Maine, where a doctor noticed that the vast majority of his patients in one day came out with problems with their sight. And it soon became known, but we already knew about it because we lectured about it prior to 2006. And it became the evolution of toxic anterior segment syndrome occurring throughout the United States. So I was a principal clinical investigator, traveled the whole country. One of the reasons why I can honestly say I have worked in all 50 states and did constant surveillance and investigation, looking at to what were the factors that could be causing. Now, there have been some propositions out there that say, oh, it's enzymatics. That's not true. That is absolutely not true. Could it be enzymatics? Could be, but usually you rinse your hair off of all the shampoo that you put in when you're getting a shower. And so what we do is we sacrifice decontamination for the essence of time management. And we'll talk about that a little more in depth. But it's literally leaving the enzymatics on the instrumentation that causes the problem, not the enzymatics themselves. And so not a big surprise, but I know a lot of physicians thought that that was the culprit. And I'm here to tell you that there was never a silver bullet, that it was always multifactorial. And so you could always find something if you looked hard enough in the central processing area, whether it be a hospital or a surgical center, that was skewed and just wasn't hitting the mark. But then I would also find other items that could contribute to the development of toxic anterior segment syndrome. So that's a little bit about what I did. And then from that, I was already at that point the national president for the American Society of Ophthalmic Registered Nurses, and was on the board there probably for about 10 years, I'd say, in total. And so that's my ophthalmology background. But Melanie, someday we'll talk orthopedics too. But that is what we're talking about today, ophthalmology.
Well, okay, so this is good though for me because I don't do eyes. We do eyes at my facility, but that's not a day that I work. So I don't see these cases regularly unless I happen to randomly pick up a shift on the eye day. But even then, because I don't do eyes, they don't put me in those cases because the eye doctors are very particular and they want their people in their room. And so the ortho girl's not going to be there. But I have heard about, you say TASS, right? So TASS, TASS. I hear it said
TASS, TASS. It's the way where you live in the country.
Yeah,
how
part of the country you're from. I've heard a lot about it, and that's where my thoughts go when I see that we do eye cases. What are we doing about TASS? How are we going to handle it? Are our patients okay? Like, what are we doing? And so, like, being able to dive deeper into what this is and how do we prevent it? How do we keep our patients safe? How do we keep our instruments safe? It's a good conversation to have for all of us because we might any day be in, I could end up working in those rooms and I need to be vigilant and I need to be aware of what's going on. But I want to know more about it. Like you've defined it and you've said it's like enzymatics or leaving these detergents on our instruments, but how does that process work to where our patients are getting sick?
So I'm not going to tell you that let me start with the definition. So toxic anterior segment syndrome is a sterile, inflammatory issue. It is not infectious. And so what you do is you have a joint session, if you will, when somebody comes. What happens is they'll have their cataract extracted. They'll go home. They can watch TV. They can read a book. They can read not necessarily newspapers anymore, but I'm that old, but they could read the newspaper. They could do similar, tasks like that and feel wonderful because the cloudiness or the opacity that's developed over their natural lens is gone. when you explain to them that we blew their lens up in their eye, that doesn't make them feel really good, but it is the way we do it with phacoemulsification. However, what happens is usually within the span of 12 to 48 hours post cataract surgery or anterior segment surgery, they're more blind than when they started. And so they appear to have this haze, this cloudiness, okay, which after having good eyesight now for a couple hours, they panic. And so cataract patients are usually seen the very next morning in the doctor's office. And in most cases, the doctor can already see the development of this cloudiness under a slit lamp. And it's
basically inflammation, right?
It's totally inflammatory
from the immune system.
Totally. And so the only way, and this is where a lot of surgeons will skinny out of this, the only way to discern whether it's toxic anterior segment syndrome or endophthalmitis, which is an infectious process, is to culture the eye. And so where we have issues is when you have a surgeon who will say, oh, that's just TASS. And they don't have that validation, as we know from central processing. They don't have that validation because they haven't cultured the eye. So culturing the eye is very important because it's going to show you if something's growing. If something's growing, it's more than likely endophthalmitis, and it's an infectious process, maybe from dirty instruments. Okay. But it's not toxic anterior segment syndrome. People can go blind from toxic anterior segment syndrome if untreated or if the patient doesn't understand. And this is very important. You're not necessarily going to get to prevent it, Melanie, because as I said, it could be multifactorial. For example, in my database that I developed over a year plus traveling not only through Canada, but then the US, it was very interesting that patients were on a minimum of 2 drugs. And the 2 drugs were, they were on a statin and they were on some kind of, they weren't necessarily diabetic, but they were either pre-diabetic or diabetic, let's say. And so they were on some kind of, long before GLPs, but they were on some kind of medication, whether it be metformin or glucoside, any of the older medicines. And almost everybody, when I reviewed all the medical records, I did literally a ceiling to a floor investigation of the ORs where this could have occurred. I honestly would walk into a room where they would have their refrigerators and microwaves to meet with the staff. And I'd have nurses literally in a heap at the table crying, saying, what are we doing that's causing this to our patients? Because you see, it was random. It was very rare. If you were doing 20 cataracts, it was very rare to say it happened to the first 10 patients. As I best described it to the nursing staff and the technical staff, but as I best described it, I could take a hat into the room, into the lounge, put it in the middle of the table, put numbers 1 through 20 in the hat, and pull out numbers. And they would be the ones that would get it that day. There was no routine about it, which made everybody crazy. But there was no routine. However, surgeons found that they were having occurrences more times than not, believe it or not, when the facility had an inadequate amount of instrument trays. And why would that be? Because they'd sterilize their instruments the night before in traditional trays, whether they be wrap or rigid containers. And in the early days, they were wrap. And then after the first 4 cases, how did they sterilize them? They were flashing them. And then years later, and even today, they're still IUSSing them, still using immediate use steam sterilization. And so that was one thing that, popped off right, because I had a sterilization background way back then. That was one of the things that would jump right off the page at me and say, you don't have one standard of care. You are changing the way that you're handling your sterilized items. And so that would be one of the things that I would discuss with them. And as a group, we would problem solve as to what they needed to do. So inadequate instrumentation was a major problem. And as we went from 10 to 15 to 45, and I actually worked in a facility where once a month we would do 75 cataracts with one surgeon. He would be late and start at 8:30 in the morning, and he'd be gone by 3:30.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
That many. Okay, how many rooms was he going into? Like for real? Two
He
rooms?
would bounce between 2 rooms,
Wow.
but I call it tush time.
Yeah.
I should have trademarked the term, but I didn't. But I called it tush time. From the time his tush hit the operating room stool to the time his tush got off the stool was always less than 2 to 3 minutes.
Wow.
That's when the average cataract time, not room time, but cataract tush time was a minimum of 15 minutes.
That is
It was
crazy.
unbelievable. Now, you would have asked me, and I'm going to tell you, would I go to him for surgery?
Yeah.
No. No. It's just a little too quick
Too
for
fast.
me.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, I mean, again, in surgery, we don't get to see our mistakes or our misadventures unless we hear about them, but you never heard about them. He was excellent, just a little too fast for my taste. However, I don't recall ever him saying that he had a toxic anterior segment syndrome problem, which is interesting, you know.
Well, he obviously was focused on process and efficiency. And so if he really managed every detail of the process, he probably removed a lot of the factors that were, like you said, contributing to that diagnosis. And it's interesting what you're saying. You know, we typically, you called it tush time. We're typically measuring like, you know, turnover times and, you know, and worried about case delays and things like that. And yeah, because cataract surgeries are quicker, the volumes are typically really high for those procedures, right? And specifically at an eye surgery center. So I kind of want to like land on what are the goals for ophthalmology as they compare maybe to other service lines? Like what are they measuring themselves around? What's most important?
Well, of course, ophthalmology, especially centers where the predominance of ophthalmology cases are being done, whether they be cosmetic or whether they be cataracts and retinas, they pretty much have moved out of the mainstream of an inpatient operating room. Some patients that do not meet the requirements for health, if they have multiple comorbidities, they might still be taken to the hospital. But that's the rarity. That's the exception. So the goals for ophthalmology shouldn't matter which environment you're in. But of course, the primary one at the head of the page should be safe patient care. That's what it should be. However, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that just as important are economic goals. And the economic goals are going to be ophthalmology. Of all the specialties, ophthalmology has probably come out as the most fixed when it comes to reimbursement. Everybody else has got huge increases and they're able to do now we did get new technology lenses if you wanted a lens that also would do refractive abilities besides just a regular replacement lens. However, that's the only exception. But ophthalmology, especially for a cataract procedure, that's pretty much fixed. We usually get maybe, I think this year it's 2.4%. Don't quote me, but I think that's what it is. And so it's minimal at best. With the way that rates go higher and higher for labor and for med-surg supplies and drugs, 2.4 doesn't even come close to being able to match what you need to do. But economically, it's always been a fix because we've always gotten slight increases in reimbursement. But if you go to a national meeting, any national meeting, and you happen to get into a subsection where people are speaking ophthalmology, what you'll soon hear, as I like to describe it very aptly, is you'll have people pounding their chest. Well, how many cataracts did you do an hour? And how many did you do an hour? And we get into this game about it's not just care time, but it's clock time. And that's where we take the train and we go far off the tracks because it becomes a beat the clock game. And this has been for at least 40 years. This is not something new. And you still will hear groups talking about that. Well, I'm doing 6 cases. At one point, if you did 4 cases an hour, you are cream of the crop. Okay. But again, one of the issues that we can speak about is not only have they been doing flash or IUSS, but I've had a personal experience where I had to let a director of nursing go because she was stopping the autoclave during a cycle when dry time had kicked in because the doctor was tap dancing all over her face. And this was a new facility that I went to. I was totally blown away. And the staff didn't rat her out either, even though they knew it was wrong. And this was in a surgical center. But I'm going to tell you, there are still people today that are doing that.
That's terrifying.
That was just shared with me a week ago in an organization.
All right, so if you're listening to this podcast, make sure you are doing a full sterilization cycle. And also this whole open flash, right? Like,
right, it's gone.
You can't do it.
It's really, you're not supposed to be doing it. And you're just waiting to get caught. You know, you don't need a surveyor or an inspector to come and point their finger at you. You should be educated enough to know those days are gone. The other thing, though, that you have to be most concerned about is I told you about the correct number of instrumentation. You've got to have enough trays. But that's where we get into one tray. If you have enough trays, one tray can provide one standard of care to each and every one of your patients. Because of the quickness of the turnaround, still doing a full cycle. There's a misconception out there that we do a shortened cycle. There's no such thing as a short cycle. We can debate that on a totally different podcast, but it doesn't exist. And there are people that are throwing that word around. And I can tell you from Amy and all the decades I've been on Amy, it doesn't exist. It was made up in a few ophthalmologists' minds, and they think that this sequential sterilization is okay. But if you read what CMS actually says, it says you have to have a complete dry time in your cycle if you're using a pan that requires dry time. Okay. So there's all these little things, but how will one tray help? One tray will help with the speed that we can give you a product that is not being flashed, that is not being immediate use steam sterilized. It is a full cycle. But in a sterilizer, that if it has an integral generator, first of all, I should say right off the bat, we are only validated and cleared in a full upright sterilizer. You cannot put a one tray into a tabletop sterilizer. Most people don't understand steam is not steam. A tabletop sterilizer works on vacuum assisted principles, where a full-size sterilizer will work with the pre-vac, where it pushes and pulls a number of times according to what you're using and what sterilizer you have. But our tray couldn't fit in a tabletop sterilizer if you tried to. That's one hint. You're not going to get it. But we are not cleared for a tabletop sterilizer. So the first way I can help you is you got to have a full-size sterilizer. But having that full-size sterilizer, we can turn a tray around once it has been properly decontaminated and cleaned. And of course, POUT, point of use treatment, has been done as soon as the procedure is done, not waiting in line for 30 trays prior to this to be turned around. You have to do point of use treatment. Okay. Then you get into decontamination and cleaning. But once all those are done and out of the way, once the tray is packaged, from the time you door close to your door open, typically is 20 to 24 minutes. And so for people that have small sterilizers, you'll be able to get 2 trays in. For people that have medium-sized sterilizers, you'll get a minimum of 4 with our smallest tray. But it's the ophthalmology still centers that are lagging behind, because some of them still do think you can interrupt the cycle. They believe that.
Yeah. I was going to ask, like, you talked about having adequate amount of instrumentation, and you're talking about the facilities, or many of them are not doing a full cycle, and many of them are still using open flash, but we know like budgets are constrained. So like, how do you help, if it's an eye surgery center, or maybe it's inpatient and it's just it's just the ophthalmology service line. Like, if they don't have the money to go out and buy lots of new instrumentation, but they're already kind of running super lean because they're interrupting the cycle, or they are open flashing, like, how do we help them get from point A to point B successfully and in a compliant way?
Well, again, the number one principle that I can't change is you have to have enough instrumentation to start with. So if you're going to work, I'll just give you my scenario. If you're working in 2 rooms, the first thing you have to do is you have to take your fastest surgeon, and you have to know what his touch time is. So if his touch time is on average 8 minutes, then you need to say, how many am I going to do in an hour? And so if he's bouncing back, or she is bouncing between rooms, you do 8 into 60, give you 8 into 45, 8 into 50. That's the number of trays you're going to need. Because when all else fails, you should always have a minimum of a tray that has been sterilized, that hasn't been opened. Because you and I both know, all of us, that there are times when somebody faints and falls over a table, knocks a whole table over, or whatever. And the thing with eye surgery is, because we stopped doing blocks with gigantic needles, we don't do the retrobulbars anymore, or the peribulbars. We do local. And so in doing local, you only have X number of minutes to really get that cataract out. So if somebody falls over a tray, or they knock them off the Mayo stand or whatever, you always want to have always an additional tray that's always on the back table meaning in the room, that's sterile to go with. So if you're working in 2 rooms and you want to do 6 cases an hour, then automatically you're going to need 8 for that hour for that fastest surgeon, because you're going to have 1 tray in each room that's sterile. You can cheat and have 1 between the 2, but let's face it, you're constantly moving. So 1 in each room, and then you need a minimum of 6 trays, because by the time you turn them over, you take the first 2 trays, you turn them over, because most do have small sterilizers, small uprights. You're only going to do 2 trays. So you work on getting the first and the second case decontaminated, cleaned, and all that good stuff, and into the sterilizer, so that by the time you get to the 3rd and the 4th cases, your first 2 are sterilized. So it's constant. So what comes with that, though, is something that also isn't done in the vast majority, but the vast majority, is that the surgical tech that works in room 1 then goes into decon and cleans the instruments hastily. And then she or he's got to go back into that operating room to be ready for the 3rd case. So there's very little time. It's inadequate. The instruments are not flushed properly. The ones that have to be put in an ultrasonic are not put into an ultrasonic. And before you know it, you've got viscoelastic, which is a byproduct. It's Gorilla Glue, and you're not getting it out. The little cannulas that we use in eye surgery, I tell people all the time, buy a box of each one that you use. We've gotten it down to pretty much 2 or 3. Buy a box of reusable ones. And when the tray comes in, put the cannulas in soaking and grab one that's fresh out of your bin, so that you don't have to waste all the time trying to clean the tips. And then you can clean them when you're not doing a tray. So there are all little tricks of the trade, and we've talked about them forever in ophthalmology. But as we know, there's a lot of turnover in surgical centers, in hospitals. And so it's whispered down the lane. Not everybody gets it. But the one thing that I would suggest, Justin, you asked the question, is to stop with this craziness of again, trying to fit too many square pegs in a round hole. Hire somebody that is knowledgeable about what does it take to do decontamination. And that person becomes a constant, not in every other, because you'll see differences between the two in the two rooms, the techs, of what they think is supposed to happen and not supposed to happen. And so that's the one thing that I would do. But when you take a one tray, what a 21 inch with a 4-inch lid, which is our smallest tray, you can not only fit the instrumentation, which is now down to about 10 instruments, the phacoemulsification handpiece, the cord, but now you've got extra room that you can eliminate all the peel pouches that you have to put up separately. You take a sponge bowl, you turn it upside down, you put it in the tray. You take medicine cups, 2, 3, however many you have on the back table, you turn them upside down and you put it in the tray. You take the light handles for the ceiling light. And then now you don't have to buy disposable light handles. You take the microscope handles, the 2, you put them in a one tray. Now you only have to open up a tray for each cataract procedure. And it can be carried through with retina also. But I limit cataract because that's the vast majority of cases that most facilities will do. However, we have the third producing, if now not up to the second producing, that only uses one tray in New York. And that's all they use is one tray. And it is a constant in and out, but they don't skimp on decontamination and cleaning.
Okay, so I have a question. As my brain is listening to this and I'm hearing one tray and you're talking about a tray and putting stuff in a tray, but how is the one tray, because you keep saying one tray like it's a thing, how is that different than the trays I've already got, than the trays we're already using? What makes the one tray so unique? Different? Yeah, so different.
It's prettier.
It is actually. I like the blue. It is very pretty.
Blue. I'm a blue person. It is prettier. No, that's a very important question. So the difference is in 50 years in the sterilization industry, one tray, when it was cleared in 2006 by the FDA, when it was cleared, one tray is the only tray that does not require dry time. Dry time, 0. The other big difference with it is because it's a fast cycle with no dry time, we were cleared with retained moisture in the tray. Why?
Yes, why?
Because our filters are not porous. Our filters are what are called hydrophobic, and they're also particulate barriers. So if you're in a particular state up north, like maybe New York, and the New York plumbing lines are breaking down, okay, and your water's coming in from the outside, and you've not even learned or you are not maintaining the filters that should be on the water that's coming into the physical plant in a hospital or a surgical center, you will see black specks in on the sterilizer walls, in the trays, but you won't see them in a one tray because our filters stop them cold. They're not getting in the tray. Back to the dry time. We are the only tray with storage. Remember, IUSS has no storage. We are the only tray with 0 dry time that has storage.
So how long can you store it?
Good question. That's up to the organization. We are cleared for 48 hours, but clearance might not be your shelf life. Your shelf life in the organizations that are progressive, the organizations understand event-related sterility. And event-related sterility that was adopted back in the mid-'80s says that until an event occurs, an item is considered sterile. At that point, 48 hours disappears because nothing's happened to the tray. However, we require a lock on both sides. If you lose a lock, the organization says these are the events that occur that make us redo the tray. But if nothing occurs, you can keep our tray, as we like to say in this neighborhood, to infinity and beyond.
So, but when I open that tray, because it doesn't have a dry time, there might be moisture in the tray, correct?
So, according to when you open it, no. We actually have done testing, and all the water, first of all, in an ophthalmology tray, there might be 0 water. I never had water. And I'll tell you what it's determined upon. But if there is water and you leave it on the shelf for 4 days, the water is gone. It turns back into a vapor and it escapes through the filters. Now, ironically, the same thing could happen if you had a tray that was porous that you put through dry time, and for whatever reason, it wasn't enough dry time that day. We all know that we get wet packs in an OR. One tray is not a wet pack. But if you put that on the shelf and you pull it off the shelf 2 days later and you open it up and you're the circulator in the room, you could go, oh heavens, why this tray is wet? It's because it never dried. Okay. Where one tray does not have to dry. It was cleared with 0 dry time.
That is mind blowing.
Mm-hmm. Kind of flip the sterilization industry on its backside.
Yeah, for sure. But think about all the time you save not waiting on those dry times.
Could be anywhere from an hour and a half to 2.5 hours, because it's according to, so what determines the amount of water in the tray? Cataract, retina, not many instruments, and they're light, they're small, they're delicate. Mentioned orthopedics, you do a major ortho tray, right? That major ortho tray could honestly, through the entire door closed to door open, and then again, equalization to the ambient temperature in the sterilizer room, could be 2 hours. Yeah. We're done in 24 minutes.
Wow.
Done.
Yeah.
Now, please use gloves because the tray is hot. Okay. And don't use a hot instrument on the patient.
Never.
But again, this is where the user's knowledge base has to come in.
Yeah.
We say it throughout our IFU. But the interesting point is trying to get people to understand that water in the tray does not make it IUSS.
Right.
There's nothing that says that. It was that immediate use steam sterilization was an abbreviated cycle. We are not an abbreviated
cycle. Yeah.
We are a full cycle following the exposure parameters of time and temperature. Dry time has nothing to do with sterilization.
It has to do with getting water out of the tray.
Exactly. Dry time is coined the maintenance of sterility. So that's what dry time has to do with. But we didn't let water into our tray. We manufactured the water in the tray, which is why it's sterile. But if water came from outside of the tray, a good microbiologist besides me could tell you that microbes can travel on a water molecule into a tray. We don't let them. We only allow steam. Everybody leaves steam and water. And so if I gave you the example, it's summertime now, the water molecule is the size of a giant beach ball, the old multicolored beach ball. And a steam molecule is the size of the tip of my nail on my pinky. Water molecules permit microbes because they're big enough to jump on. This is way too small, a steam molecule, and microbes can't get into our tray. And so that's why water is permitted in our tray. And we had to test it and prove that as long as you follow the IFU, our water in the tray is 100% sterile, just like the bottle of water that's sitting in the OR in the cabinet.
Barbara, you were talking a lot about, different practices, and one of them was, stopping the cycle before it's done. But another one you told me about a couple of weeks ago was walking unused instruments from one case to another. And you've still seen this happening?
As of last week, what is happening is, again, yeah.
Sorry. No.
What is happening? Not in a one tray, but this is part of the solution for people that are still doing this. And they are. They'll take a tray, and whether it be in a rigid container or wrapped, they'll take it into OR1. They'll open it up. They'll have the scrub take out the sterile instruments that they need. They'll take it through the substerile or into the corridor if they don't have substeriles, into OR2, and have them take the remainder of the instruments and the other phaco handpiece out of it to use on the second case. That is fact.
So the two straining factors, I think, for a lot of facilities, but, definitely these service lines is, staff and instrumentation. and you've got to have an adequate amount of both. And another thing I want you to touch on before we wrap up is you've got a staffing algorithm that you use to help make sure. I mean, like a lot of places just aren't sure they right size. Like if they are walking instruments from one case to another, if they are open flashing, like how do they set the new baseline that is going to put them in a position to be, a well functioning? You said at the very top, your primary objective should be patient care, but we understand that there's some finances. We definitely learned how OneTray can help with some of that, but can you talk about your staffing algorithm just so like anybody out there who's questioning can kind of get a heat check?
Sure. So again, if you're using, and here's the thing, in all of my on-site surveillance, not only for TASS, but when I go in to prepare people for accreditation, I can share with you that in doing that, it's very easy to grasp what's going on. And most of the time it's ineffective communication. And they'll double up and do stuff when they only need one person to do it. I can actually prove and help organizations take 2 rooms and get it down to 1. With efficiencies, with effectiveness, you can provide care without harming a patient just as fast in 1 room. But again, it starts with having the appropriate staff and having the appropriate number of trays to be able to turn those rooms around. But where staffing is concerned, usually if you're using 2 rooms, you'll have 2 techs, 2 scrub techs, and then you'll have 2 circulators. And then you still need to have 1 person that's going to rotate between the 2 rooms so that they can help move the patient in and out while the team itself located in either room is preparing for the next case. And then in addition, I advocate for a constant in the decontamination room. That person's going to know the instruments better than the doctor, better than anybody, because he or she will have touched every single one of them. And rather than getting under a microscope in case 3, where there's a bent pick, that person should have already known that in decon. But with people running in and out, constantly the door swinging both ways, that's hardly picked up until the surgeon picks up the pick under the microscope and goes, I can't use this, So you're talking time, effort, continuity of care, staffing, but you're talking about a lot of education and training that's still missing. And not just with ophthalmology, but in the total surgical complex where there can be a better way of doing what you're doing today. But that is the advantages with OneTray, with not having to have any dry time, having to have a full-size sterilizer though, and having this staffing complement that will always get you where you need to be.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And, we do have some bonus content. So for those of you who have downloaded our smartphone app for iPhone and Android, definitely click the gift box in this episode. You can view that. We'll also have a link to a resource page in the write-up. And Barbara, how can they reach you if they want assistance with their ophthalmology procedures?
Sure. I can be reached at bharmer, HARMER, at onetray.com.
Excellent. For any of you out there who wants to learn more or just kind of follow along on OneTray's journey, you can find them on LinkedIn and Facebook. You can send a general email, info@onetray.com, or call the office 937-619-0138. And as always, follow the OneTray IFU for use. And Barbara, anything you want to add before we wrap up?
We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. We all have 2 eyes. And if you're lucky enough never to develop cataracts or need retina surgery, but most of us will. So be very cautious and ask questions. My husband had to have a cataract surgery after a retina issue. And I called the director of nursing and said, I want to know how you process your instruments. I feel as a nurse first, that if I take care of everybody else, I need to take care of my own too.
100%, Barbara. That's a great story. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me. Thank you very much.
This was fun. I learned a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was Barbara Ann Harmer, Vice President of Clinical Services with IST1 Tray. And Melanie, it's crazy to hear that people are still shortening the cycle, carrying unused instruments from one case to another and open flashing instruments. I mean, these are things I feel like we've been talking about for quite some time, but, it's just about getting the information out there, but also having a realistic solution that can marry up, any financial constraints that are happening at the account as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like she's talking about these things and I'm like, what are we, the Wild West of surgery that we're doing these things? And that you look at the flip side and you look at the constraints and the speed and the, or maybe even lack of education and training. And you can at least understand maybe why some of these bad habits came into play, even though they are bad habits and wrong. So how do we provide that solution to stop the bad habits, to provide the best patient care? And that's where One Tray really excels. Here's the solution. So you stop doing these bad, dangerous things and you can do it faster and better, more efficiently.
Yeah, you can kind of keep the speed up, but still know that you're running a full cycle and that you're delivering sterilized instruments. I always had a hunch. It was kind of cool to hear Barbara confirm it. I always had a hunch that one of the contributing factors to TASS was residual enzymatic, because when you were, and I definitely knew several people who worked in eye surgery centers, ironically at one in Maine. So I forgot to ask Barbara if it was the same facility, but I knew that they were open flashing, back in, the late 2000s leading into 2010. And a lot of times they were just quickly washing and they only had a 2 sink system. So they would kind of, soak and wash and then rinse and then put into the tray. And I feel like they just probably were not getting, a complete rinse on the instruments. And in some cases, I think they might have been just rinsing underneath the water versus actually, submerging the instruments into a rinse. And so, somewhat concerning there too, when you think about that, but it was interesting to hear her describe some of her expertise in investigating that.
Yeah. Blows my mind. Interesting to just learn all about it from her.
All right, well, download the bonus content from the smartphone app. Click on that gift box icon for the episode. You can reach out to Barbara as well, bharmer@onetray.com, or email their general email inbox, info@onetray.com, phone number 937-619-0138. Follow them on LinkedIn and Facebook. And I wanted to say this as we were closing out, but I saved my pun as the best for last. Barbara said you've got 2 eyes, so keep at least one of them on all of your IFUs. And on behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this Vendor Spotlight on First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.